Welcome to a lecture on intertextualism and the poetry of Robert Frost. By the end of this video, you should be able to understand the central tenets of the literary critical method of intertextualism and the central literary critical concepts that apply to Robert Frost's poetry, and then be able to take those concepts and apply them to your interpretation of a Robert Frost poem. But let's begin with a Frost quote that addresses the idea of intertextualism. In a letter, Frost wrote, "A poem is best read in light of all other poems ever written. We read A better to read B. We have to start somewhere. We maybe get very little out of A. Read B better to read C. C the better to read D. D the better to go back and read A. Progress is not the aim, but circulation. The thing, as a reader, is to get among the poems where they hold each other apart in their places as the stars do." So two key intertextual concepts that come out of Robert Frost's suggestions to readers. We must circulate around the poems. We must read the poems for central ideas or concepts, and then look for those very concepts in other poems. And then, as he says, when you get into the other poems, you need to read for the ways in which the other poems build upon, enhance, add on to central concepts that have been established in other poems, and the ways in which those other poems deviate from those central concepts. And that is not just reading around Robert Frost poetry to understand other poems written by Frost, but reading around all poetry. So Frost has really given us a good suggestion on why intertextualism, the idea of reading around other texts for concepts and then applying those concepts to future texts, helps us as readers of poetry and readers of any text. Well, let's briefly try to get into the central concepts of intertextualism as a new critical lens through which we can approach poetry. One of the central concepts of an intertextualist is that texts reflect other texts and not just reality. Unlike formalists that believe that meaning primarily derives from looking at the way poetic devices interact with each other within the poem, and unlike historicists who believe that literary texts are manifestation of biographical events in a poet's life, or manifestations of a literary historical context in which the text is written, or manifestations of the author's intentions, intertextualists believe that poems are talking to other poems. They're interacting with the concepts in other poems, and that is the way in which they differentiate their meaning. In addition, the goal of intertextualists is to show how conventions are manipulated, how concepts are manipulated. And we can get those concepts just by reading other poems and thinking about the concepts that are established in them, but even more instructively, we get the concepts by reading literary criticism and gleaning the literary criticism for key concepts that we can then wield an interpretation of our own. Just like a Supreme Court justice reads the precedent, past interpretations of the Constitution for concepts that they can then wield in their new judicial opinion, in their new interpretation of a section of the Constitution. In addition, the intertextualists believe that the more informed a critic, an interpreter, is about conventions and concepts, the more complete her interpretation will be. And this brings up the issue is what is our goal here in the course as a reader? We are not just trying to read for our own understanding of the poem or for the ways in which the poem resonate with us. We are trying to establish a complete interpretation, and complete meaning robust, meaning accurate, meaning truthful interpretation. And the more lenses we have upon a literary text, the more likely those layers of interpretation will allow us to arrive at a complete interpretation. And in particular, for intertextualism, the more concepts we wield, the more concepts that we've seen in other poems, the more concepts that we wield from literary interpretation and quote from that literary interpretation, the more valid, the more self-validating our interpretation will be, which is really the goal, which is the next tenet of intertextualism. The best way, they argue, to create a self-validating interpretation is to study all other similar texts that employ similar conventions or concepts and employ these concepts in interpretation. So what are we going to do? How are we going to do that? Well, as I've already mentioned, we're going to mine literary criticism. We're going to read short pieces of literary criticism for the concepts that the critic has established in certain poems, and then be able to know those concepts, quote those concepts, actually quote the literary critic, and be able to wield those concepts in our interpretation. And finally, like formalists who believe that there are good poems and bad poems, intertextualists value texts. They believe that the best texts have multitudinous associations with other texts. They have many concepts that are being addressed in the poem that are established in other poems by the same author or by other concepts established by other authors. For example, when we read After Apple Picking by Robert Frost, we know that the picking of apples reminds us of the ultimate after apple picking poem, which is Paradise Lost, which is really a text that is addressing the first chapter of the Bible, Genesis, and the fall of man. And so those multitudinous association between texts, between concepts, make texts rich and really interesting to read. Well, you might be asking, so what? Why do we need to do this? What's interesting about being intertextualist? The trick, they argue, is to identify how the work deviates, how it perpetuates, adds on to, and identifies itself against the background of literary critical concepts at work in the poem. Okay? You'll see that there are common literary critical concepts that occur frequently in the poetry of Robert Frost, and the trick is to, when you're looking at the poem in front of you, to be able to take those concepts, apply them, and establish in your interpretation how those concepts are enhanced and how they are deviated from in the current poem. So, let's take a look at a poem by Robert Frost, which is a very difficult poem. We don't need to know anything about Robert Frost's life. We don't need anything about his intentions. In this poem, we don't necessarily need to know the literary historical context, that he's a modern poet inheriting the Romantic tradition of writing about poetry, although those things would help immensely. And you will see that when I read this poem with you, and annotate it with you, that I always begin with the formal elements. It's impossible not to begin with imagery and connotations and simile and metaphor and tone shifts. Those are the building blocks of meaning. But intertextualists say that's just the beginning. They're not ignoring the value of formalism. They're saying, hey, we need to look at literary critical concepts and apply those on top of our formal reading. So let's look at Hyla Brook. Hyla Brook is a poem about a small brook that ran through his Derry, New Hampshire farm that he inherited from his grandfather after he dropped out of Harvard University. He went there to write poetry, but his grandfather said, you're going to have to work this farm and keep it in good working order so that you could provide food for your family. And he wrote some of his great poems on the Derry, New Hampshire farm. Poems like The Road Not Taken, Mending Wall, Birches, After Apple Picking, The Death of the Hired Man, Home Burial, all come out of his experience on the Derry, New Hampshire farm. Just a little background, this is a brook that he's encountered in June, as you can see from the first line, and it no longer has any water in it, and he doesn't know what to make of it. He doesn't know what to do with this uninspiring, dead, waterless brook. And the question I want us to think about is, what does Hyla Brook say about the human reaction to nature's dissolution, to nature's loss? Okay, let's have a read. By June, our brook's gone out of song and speed. Sought for much after that, it will be found either to have gone groping underground and taken with it all the Hyla breed that shouted in the mist a month ago, like ghosts of sleigh bells in a ghost of snow, or flourished and come up in jewel weed, Weak foliage that is blown upon and bent, even against the way its waters went. Its bed is left a faded paper sheet of dead leaves stuck together by the heat. A brook to none, but who remember long. This, as it will be seen, is other far than with brooks taken otherwhere in song. We love the things we love for what they are. Well, if you're an aficionado of romantic poetry or Victorian poetry, you're looking for the one or two lines that you want to write down in your notebook and keep with you. And Frost knew that. He knew the reader was expecting that. And so I hope you'll agree with me that the line that sticks out, and the one that I would put in my notebook, is that wonderful notion that we love the things we love for what they are. For what they are in truth, for what they are in reality. Not what we want them to be, not what we hope they will be, but we take things on their face value, and we appreciate them in full, and we love them. It's a wonderful concept. Although, I think as you can see, as you will see as we work our way through the poem, that this line, we love the things for what they are, is called into question by the imagery, by the simile, by the metaphors that are established in the poem. So let's walk through. By June our brook has gone out of song and speed. No water, nothing to inspire, no sound, nothing beautiful to catch our eye to write a poem about. If it's sought for much after that, imaginatively, you will find it to have gone groping underground. And taken with it all the hyla breed. Now you need a little biology background here, but hyla breed here are the frogs that were chirping near this stream, this hyla brook that was full of water, in May, a month ago. They shouted in the mist, those misty spring mornings in New Hampshire a month ago. In May. And so he remembers, he uses his memory here to go back to when this brook was full, when it was rushing by, when there were frogs in their hearing their mating song and reproducing the fecundity, the life, the spirituality of that moment. He goes back in his memory to be inspired. But then he takes it further, and words like or as we need to identify and circle when we're reading a poem. Because he compares the song, the chirping, the shh of the hyla breed to a ghost of sleigh bells and a ghost of snow. Well, if we were to break down that metaphor into its tenor, its subject, the V is the vehicle, what it's compared to, we see that the sound of chirping is being compared to the sound of sleigh bells. Well, you're wondering, how did he come up with that? Well, Frost probably remembers working out on the farm in the wintertime and maybe doing some logging out there on the edges of his farm. He's being pulled by his sleigh, is being pulled by horses. The horses have bells on their harnesses, and they're shaking as the snow's falling in a very spiritual, very one with nature moment. He goes not just to May, when the frogs were chirping. He takes us to January. He takes us to December. He takes us further back. He doesn't just say they're like sleigh bells shaking in snow. He says that they are ghosts. So there's sort of an ethereal, apparition-like quality to this memory. How far away are we from the brook that's full of dead leaves stuck together by the heat? Nothing there to inspire, nothing there to catch the eye, nothing there to catch the ear when we go back to the frogs in May and then all the way back to sleigh bells shaking in a winter snowstorm. Or, he says to the reader, you may imaginatively find it, the water has gone underground and it has flourished and come up in jewelweed, a plant. Weak foliage that is now blown upon a bent. So now the manifestation of this water, where has it gone underground? It's now being used by these plants, and now we see the product of that lost water. But it's weak foliage, it's blown upon and bent, even against the way its waters went. So as the stream went down, we are getting, and now the wind is blowing these jewel weeds back. Its bed, the bed of the brook, in a metaphor here, is now a faded paper sheet of dead leaves stuck together by the heat. It's now a letter with words faded off. It's now, I like to think of it as a love letter with words that no longer mean anything. There's nothing here to inspire, just dead leaves stuck together by the heat of June. It's a brook to none. It's just an empty bed. It's a brook to none, but who have a long memory. This, as it will be seen, is far greater than with brooks taken otherwhere in song. We love the things we love for what they are. So what he's saying here at the end, it seems to me, is that there are many poems about brooks and how inspiring they are, full of water and the waves and the eddies and the sound and the birds and the frogs and chirping. It's easy to write a poem about that. It is far greater to try to find something inspirational, imaginatively and through memory, with a brook that has no water, that really has nothing to inspire. Well, we got there through imagery, we got there through connotations, we got there through looking at similes and metaphors. We didn't talk about tone, but he may be ironic in his tone there at the end, because he knows he hasn't loved the brook for what it is. He's loved it for what it's reminded him of. But there may be some truth here in this last line. There may be a larger truth of seeing the brook as a process and not the brook as just an empty bed, waterless bed of dead leaves. Let's take a look at some of the literary critical concepts that came from reading Frost's criticisms of other poems. There are many. And one of the things that reoccurs in criticism of Robert Frost's poems, and even just reading the poems themselves, is the speaker's desire, the speaker of a poem, the I in the poem, the speaker's desire for a true knowledge of the thing. He doesn't want sentimental fictions. He doesn't want romantic depictions of nature or anything that he's describing. He wants to know the thing in itself. And so that's where we start. He wants to know this brook. And let's skip down to number 5, because number 5 is related to that, and it's the pathetic fallacy. Pathetic fallacy is the idea that we project our own emotions onto an object, and we can't think of the object as not being associated with that emotion. But the object itself obviously can't contain that emotion. John Ruskin wrote that when one is under the pathetic fallacy, the emotional fallacy, the mind is endeavoring to express something which he, as a living creature, imagines in the lifeless object. The pathetic fallacy occurs when we are under the influence of emotion or contemplative fancy, imagination, false appearances, I say, as being entirely unconnected with any real power or character in the object and only imputed to it by us. Well, he does experience the pathetic fallacy, the emotional fallacy here, by going in his imagination toward where the brook once was and what it reminds him of in his imagination. And let's talk about number 3 and number 6 together. There is a desire in Frost poetry, and critics have picked up on this, a desire for self-delusion during a declining or hopeless situation in order to maintain faith in the world. Frost struggled with religious faith, but he wanted to have faith in the world in which he experienced. And in order to do that, often in his poetry, he will willingly delude himself as to what's happening and pretend that it's not happening, pretend that it's not actually occurring in order to maintain faith in the world. And so one of the concepts I would wield in interpretation is that there is a willful self-deception that is a key to faith. And the critic wrote, there's a human tendency towards self-delusion in reaction to a hopeless situation. In particular, this is a literary criticism of the poem October. The speaker and the tree delude themselves by refusing to exist in winter. And so instead of accepting things as they are, through imagination and through memory, poets will often, in particular Frost, will often go beyond the scene and delude themselves into imagining what the scene could be or what it once was. And this brings us, I think, to one of the central concepts that comes out of Heilbrook in the literary criticism, is that experiences and objects are a joint venture of past, present, and the future. That all things as we experience them really are a combination of what they once were, what they currently are, and what they will be. To know something in reality, to know something in truth, is to be able to understand that things do not just arrive upon us as we experience them, but they are evolutionary. They are gone through a process in the past, and that currently are in the present are going through a process that will manifest in the future. Certainly he shows that with going back to the Hyla breed and the brook full of water, and he goes into the future of now it's jewel, or actually in the present, now it's jewelweed, and future jewelweed, future plants will manifest from the water that is now roaming underground. So lots of concepts here that we could wield in an interpretation that we wouldn't have gotten to without an understanding of literary critical concepts. The last two that come to mind that you could wield in an intertextual interpretation are there's a difference between a human perception of nature and a natural perception of nature if you could grant nature a perspective. To the brook, there's nothing wrong here. It's lost its water, it's what it does. There's no lack of inspiration, there's no desire for inspiration, but humans go to these areas hoping to see an inspiring scene, and then disappointed in what they see, they have this imaginative and experience of memory to enhance the scene. And so recognizing that disconnect between nature, the ecocentric perspective of the brook doing what it does, and the human desire for something else. And then finally, we mentioned this, Frost often wrote poems that implied his desire for faith in the world and faith in God. And a providential God is a God who has a plan, a beneficent plan, a good plan, in which bad things ultimately result in a greater good. And so often Frost's poems address the dissolution or decay in nature and question the providence of God, question the beneficent intentions of God. And so the critic wrote, God does not influence the world in a positive way, does not ensure the balance of opposites in good and evil, and destruction and growth in many of his poems like Fire and Ice, Design, Once by the Pacific, and many others. And so you could write about what kind of God is this, what kind of manifestation of God's work is this nature that we're experiencing. Lots to chew on here, lots to go back and apply to the poem. So, if I were to show you, to model, how to apply these literary critical concepts to Hyla Brook, I would go back up, whoopsies, I would go back up, and I would look at a couple concepts that I think work together. And they are the first couple, the desire for a true knowledge of the thing, desire to get to know the brook as a whole. His tendency to transform any experience by his memory, his imagination is certainly in there. I could wield that in my interpretation. And his belief that if you're going to know something truly, you need to understand that all things, all experiences, all objects are joint ventures or amalgamation of the past, present, and future. So let's try to wield those three things in our interpretation of Hyla Brook. Let's go back up and look. So clearly, and we identified this in our first read, that when we get down into that the brook is without water, and he takes us to the Hyla breed, the frogs chirping a month ago, he's exploring his remembrance of this brook when it once was full of life and full of fecundity. And he takes us even farther back in his imagination and in his memory to the sleigh bells and that one with nature experience going out and logging on his farm. And he also imagines here, as he says, well, I can't see it, but I can imagine toward it that the water is now underground and that the manifestation of this water is now in jewelweed. So memory and imagination become key to that concept of self-delusion. He doesn't accept the loss of water in this brook as the end of inspiration. He goes back in his memory to be inspired. He imagines toward underground water, and the plants he's now experiencing are manifestations of that underground water. And that leads us to the final concept, that things, experiences, objects in nature are a manifestation of past, present, and future. So this brook is the brook of a month ago, full of water, full of frogs chirping. It is the brook of the jewelweed. It's now, its song, its speed, its water, its energy, its spirituality is now manifest in this current, present plant life. And then the future, more foliage, more jewelweed, more plants will manifest from the water that we imaginatively know is going underground. And so focusing on those three literary critical concepts, that memory and imagination is key to self-delusion, and self-delusion is the key to faith, allow us to get at loving this brook. Not we're loving this brook for what it is as a manifestation of past water, present foliage, and future foliage. So even though we made the argument that this is dramatic irony, that this is contradicted by the imagery, connotations, similes, and metaphors, that he isn't loving this brook for what it is, ultimately one could make the argument that he is seeing the brook as a manifestation of the past, of the present, and the future, and he currently is seeing it for what it is as a process. Never would have gotten there, would have been hopelessly lost had I not had those literary concepts from literary criticism to wield in my interpretation of this poem. So, another layer beyond formalism, another layer beyond what Frost said about what he was trying to do in this poem, another layer beyond his biographical events that he lived on this farm and this brook ran through his farm, are the concepts from literary criticism, and ultimately, again, just to go back to the tenet, intertextualist belief, poems are about other poems, more particularly, poems are about other concepts established in those poems, and our literary critics help us see that. So, let's have a look, a little bit of practice here, for how this can be applied in a poem on your own. Again, another nature poem called October. He wrote early on in his life. And the same question that I applied to Hyla Brook, I'd like you to apply to the poem October. What do we learn about the speaker's perspective of nature by focusing on the intertextual concepts that manifest themselves in this poem? Let's have a read. October. O hushed October morning mild, thy leaves have ripened to the fall. Tomorrow's wind, if it be wild, should waste them all. The crows above the forest call, tomorrow they may form and go. O hushed October morning mild, begin the hours of this day slow. Make the day seem to us less brief. Hearts not averse to being beguiled, beguile us in the way you know. Release one leaf at break of day. At noon release another leaf, one from our trees, one far away. Retard the sun with gentle mist, enchant the land with amethyst. Slow, slow, for the grape's sake, if they were all. Whose leaves already are burnt with frost, whose clustered fruit must else be lost, for the grape's sake, along the wall. As many of you know, New England is this kaleidoscope of red and yellow and green and orange leaves in fall. And if you go on a hike in New England, you can look out on this kaleidoscope of colors as the leaves are turning. And obviously the speaker is hoping that October will slow down, that the season will slow down, that it will not waste all the leaves at once. That's all that's left are empty branches and the cold, decaying season of winter. And so he commands it to beguile us, trick us, confuse us, make us believe by releasing one leaf at a time, one close, one far away. Slow down the sunset, retard the sun, slow it down with gentle mist, and fusing through the scene, enchant the land with purple amethyst. Slow down. The grapes are burned with frost already. Things are decaying. Things are in a state of dissolution, but slow it down. Let us appreciate this beauty as if the grapes were all. It seems to be implying that there is a fear of human loss. Time is going, and the grapes and the leaves are not the only things in a state of dissolution, a state of decay. So what would we do? How would you certainly could approach this formally and should approach this formally, but to add another layer of interpretation, it's really helpful if you take a moment after this video and apply the intertextualism concepts from literary criticism to help you with your understanding of this poem. You can press pause, you can go back to my voiceover narration on some of the concepts and go back and look at some of the language from the literary critic. And you can choose any of those 8 that I reviewed above, but the ones that come to mind here are willful self-delusion to maintain faith, the desire to be beguiled, and, like the one we ended with in Hyla Brook, desire to see all objects as a manifestation of past, present, and future. In order to understand this poem, wielding these concepts, in order to achieve the ultimate goal, which is the desire to know a thing in and of itself, to know the truth of an experience. Is important. All 3 are important here in your interpretation of Robert Frost's October. So give it a shot. You can use those 3, or you can use a couple of the ones I suggested and grab some other ones. But press pause, go back and look at some of the other concepts in this video, and write a paragraph in which you wield the language of the literary critical concepts as one layer of interpretation on this poem that will get you closer to the most robust and complete interpretation possible. Thank you.